Welcome to the newest episode of the European Republic, the podcast where we talk with interesting people from the European space. And today I have, as always, a special guest, Carlos. Welcome on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. I think what's very interesting and special about you from the people I interview is that while most or everyone I talk to is somehow active for Europe and activist, most of us have some like humanities background, like philosophy or law, political science, but you are actually a scientist. You have a background in mathematics and you are currently a researcher in Edinburgh still? Or
Not yet. I will be there for a little bit, but I am in the US remotely.
so maybe let's start with a little bit with your background. So what do you do as a scientist? Where are you based? What's your story? And how did you come to become active for Europe and especially for Ukraine?
Yes. So my background is, as we would say, a run-of-the-mill theoretical physicist. For those who know, they know. So this means that I went to university, I studied physics, then I got more into mathematics, and eventually I came into research in theoretical physics, which is about all these popular topics that in pop science are very well known, like quantum mechanics and relativity theory and all those things. Um, so I did my master's in Cambridge and then my PhD in Edinburgh, and I've had a long relationship with Edinburgh since. I am still in contact. I am not working there at the moment. At the
Mhm.
moment, I have a remote PI position at the Wolfram Institute based in Boston, but it operates remotely. So this gives me a very unusual amount of freedom as a researcher, academic type, and that gives me the ability and time and resources to be able to do like a campaign for Ukraine, like the one that we're probably going to discuss later. So those are basically my coordinates. I came into science as a very enthusiastic kid. I
Mhm.
didn't. I The usual story. Many people say that, oh, I had this teacher that really inspired me. I had wonderful teachers along the way, but it was more like something grew on me. And when I was 12, I said I want to be a theoretical physicist, and I did. So that's kind of a story.
Mhm. So you early on knew that you wanted to do that. What's for
Absolutely
you the fascination with theoretical physics? Because
right.
it's not trivial. It's very hard. It's a lot of maths.
Yes. Yes, that's a good question. My fascination, I think, comes from I remember distinctly the first time that my dad told me about physics. I was around 12 at the time, 11,
Mhm.
12, and I was asking a lot of questions as a kid does, but I wasn't that young. So at some point I said, Dad, of course, at the time I loved dinosaurs and I wanted to be a paleontologist, as many kids do. And I said, Dad, all these questions that I'm asking, which were questions about random things. I saw the clouds. Oh, where are the clouds that shape? Or what? All kinds of random questions about the world, so to speak. And I said, if I want to be a paleontologist, if I like dinosaurs, what do I want to be if I like these questions? And he said, oh,
Mhm.
maybe you should look into physics. And this is the first time I ever heard that word. So I got into it by buying some popular science books, like Stephen Hawking, kind of, early uh, divulgation of science books. This Universe in a Nutshell, this kinds of
Mhm.
style of books. So I became very, very interested in the mathematics of physics. Because, funnily enough, I used to say I hated math in school. I mean, I did hate the math subject at school because it was taught very poorly. It was just arithmetic and a lot of bunch of computations and very very dry. So I came to terms with a bit later. I came to terms with the fact that I loved math. Actually, the math that was necessary for physics was very descriptive, was very somehow intuitive, although technically difficult. But I always felt that the technical difficulty was the price you paid for the elegance and the power of the descriptive power of these tools. So I became totally enamored with mechanics and the science of motion, right, which is in some sense the foundation of physics, is historically what physics has been
Yeah.
about. And basically that was my entire career. I became totally fascinated with the science of motion when I was 13, 14. I learned calculus outside of the school curriculum just to get to the physics earlier when I was supposed to. And then even to the end of my PhD or even today, I'm still working on that field, obviously
Mhm.
at a more advanced stage. But that was my fascination. I mean, I could say many things about it, but I think that's a good nutshell of how I got to physics. I had many first-hand experiences, like going to my grandma's apartment and seeing a hanging rope and just playing with it, and seeing the perturbations propagate in the hanging rope, and thinking about what equation governs this, and then going to the books and realizing that it was much more complicated than the basic wave equation, and these kinds of anecdotes that really um, uh, crystallized in me a passion for the beauty of mathematics describing the world. And so I
Mhm.
became very interested in that, in the fact that we can't describe the world at all. So I got more into the math of how we do that, instead of like the specifics of the theory or discovering new phenomena and things like that. I was very interested in the patterns that we could describe.
Mhm. Fascinating. Um, but you're only not only doing like theoretical physics and the mathematics behind it. So I understand like the mathematical foundations are your core research area, or what would you say is like where you do most of your research?
Oh, yes. So mathematical foundations is a perfect term to use for what
Hmm.
my research area is. At the moment, I've actually uh, kind of exited the mainstream of my research, which was what we could say the science of motion in a very general sense, mechanics and classical mechanics, quantum mechanics, these kinds of things. Nowadays, I'm actually working on hypergraphs. So these are networks. These are mathematical models for networks, for complex networks, highly connected networks.
Hmm.
Things you can imagine, things like the brain or communication networks, the internet, supply networks, all kinds of human-made systems or biologically adjacent systems, like the economy and the ecosystems and things like that. So I am working for my project at the Wolfram Institute. My job, right, my main job nowadays as PI is in a research project about the mathematics of networks.
Hmm.
So it's specifically about hypergraphs. For those in the audience that have ever heard this term, which I guess is maybe one or two, it's basically about networks that can represent connectivity between more than two nodes. Typically, a
Hmm.
network you imagine as a bunch of nodes with a bunch of lines between them connecting them. Hypergraphs or hypernetworks are simply representations where you have more than two nodes being connected at the same time. So instead of just lines, you also see triangles and squares and things like that, connecting many nodes. So that's my current project. It's the first time that I've actually become more of an applied mathematician, in the sense that my research is directly applicable to a lot of areas in technology. In fact, I've already collaborated with technologists. For example, helped build an app for music visualization in this case, but just used some of this network stuff. I helped some brain data science research as well. I've been in conversations with people doing all kinds of applications in I have some examples, but for example, in ecology or in economics, where they describing relations between agents and things like that. So it's a very foundational topic. The actual research I do is not so applicable because it's very theoretical. It's very, as we say, purely mathematical in the sense of pure math. But the scope and the context is extremely applicable. It's very much about this highly interconnected world that we live in.
Hmm.
And it turns out that the mathematics to describe the highly connected systems that we all are surrounded by and we all want to understand are not well developed. These mathematics are fairly obscure and at times reliant on simpler math that, although effective, does not do justice to the full complexity of the problem
Hmm.
many times. So, and not to get into the topic of my research, but that is kind of what I do right now, which is does not follow from my origins in basically being a mechanics guy, all about you know quantum mechanics and classical mechanics. This is different. This is about network science, mathematics of graphs and so on. But yeah, it's what's going on at the moment.
That's a very fascinating area of research because, I mean, the better you can describe mathematically this kind of networks, the better you can model them. And we have them, like, as you said, everywhere,
Everywhere. Yeah.
especially in the social sciences. I mean, that's a bit where I can connect with my background as a philosopher. I also did during my postgraduate masters some social modeling, building some models of social interactions with our own networks,
Hmm.
basically, or you would describe them mathematically.
For sure.
And so it's highly relevant. And especially now as the world gets more and more complex and we have things like social media and AI, they all rest on that.
Oh yeah.
Um, but if one looks at your like trajectory, you get like into even more and more broader fields, and
Mhm.
that's also one thing you're doing. Not only the research, but you're also like part of this society for multidisciplinary and fundamental research. So your
Mhm.
curiosity drove you not to only be a narrow specialist, but someone who's really trying to look at the
Yes.
big picture. Can you maybe tell us more about the
I will. I would love
SEMF?
to. I love to talk about this society. Obviously, this is my brainchild in a way. We set up with a few
Mhm.
friends over here in Spain. And as you say, it was a response to broadening of interest, which historically, if you look at my career, it does look like a broadening because it became extremely laser focused on mechanics and fundamental physics. This was my target from a very early age. I mean, earlier than normally people make those decisions because they were
Yeah.
not even subjects in school when I decided it. And then later on, in the last 5 years or so, we've expanded. We set up this student group back in my alma mater in Valencia for extracurricular studies. So we could basically do more physics. Even we were physics students, but we went to do even more physics and more math, mostly more math because physics sometimes is lacking math education. So yeah, so eventually we started to get a lot of input from people that were doing studies in computer science, studies in humanities, studies in engineering, and even music and things like that. So eventually we decided, okay, we need to broaden this and just be neutral and say something like multidisciplinary. I wanted to add fundamentals so we still have a sense of going at the hard questions of the foundational topics and the core theoretical core of science. But for me personally, even though that seems like a progression into, more and more opening, actually, that's how I began. Right, as I told you when I was a kid, I
Mhm.
was just interested in everything. It sounds very cliche or very naive, but I was the typical kid that just wanted to understand the world. I was looking around and say, oh, I want to get patterns and make sense of what I'm looking at, which is a common story among physicists when they tell you that they wanted to be physicists from a young age. Normally they tell these stories like, yeah, I wanted to understand stuff. I was curious to see mechanisms where there were no human-made mechanisms. Right? That's usually like the physicist mindset. Um, and so one of my first questions, for example, I remember was, we all study biology in school, and you see how the teacher tells you there's this proteins being synthesized here, and they get into vesicles, and they get basically deployed to this other part of the cell. And I said, oh, that's all well and good, but how do these vesicles know where to go? Because as
Mhm.
far as I can understand, these vesicles are some like oil droplets, and you know, and of course at the time the teacher didn't know, and I think at the time it was not even fully known what was the mechanism for the motion of vesicles. But now, actually, if you read up nowadays, you would see that there's basically an industry, a biological industry of vesicles being pulled around with little machines that move them like a factory. It's really like a molecular factory. It's
Mhm.
not an analogy. It's not a way of making it understandable. It's really, when you look at it with a microscope, it's like a molecular factory. So it looks like something has been engineered to do all that process. And obviously, at the time, I was already very suspicious about it. But even today, I'm like, wait a minute, who designed this? Right? Obviously, no one designed it. It evolved, and it's a phenomenon of life, and it's one of the hardest problems that we have nowadays in science. The origin of life, as it's called. Right? This is one, in my opinion, one of the most pressing and important frontiers of science. The origin of life problem is about how do we go from a sort of geochemical system to a living planet system, right? That is the actual problem. Like it's mapping out the steps and the process. So it is in some sense very specialized. But what is at the foundation of this problem is that we don't understand how systems start to do living like things, or we could say things like computation start to store information, evolve, and so on. Right? We really don't understand the basic laws, if there are any, which I think there are, but we still don't know them about these processes. Right? So anyway, that is what I had a sense of when I was very young, and when we launched this society, SEMF, Society for Multidisciplinary and Fundamental Research in Spanish acronym, we decided to just go front and center for these problems, right? The hard problem of consciousness, origin of life, complexity science, big human systems like economics, political systems, all these really big problems that are completely intractable from the conventional point of view of math and science, right? We wanted to have them front and center and bring some of the. I mean, I think physicists are very enthusiastic. I am very enthusiastic. I'm very positivist by temperament. I don't know if philosophically, but by temperament, I'm very positivist. So I think our physicists are. And certainly the history of 20th century physics makes you a positivist, or should make you a positivist. So we wanted to bring that enthusiasm and all that mathematical methodology from the hardcore theoretical physics side of the world to this complexity sciences, social sciences, all other kind of obviously more application driven contexts and so on. So that is the explanation for this society. This has been my main role outside of my job, my day job, so to speak, as a researcher. I've been the president director of this organization for the last 5 years, and I have to say it's been a humbling experience. It's been an amazing experience to set up. At first, during the pandemic, we had to set up online conferences, and we brought together really interesting profiles, really high-profile people from all around the world. And then since 2023, we've been doing our on-site summer schools here in Spain, and summer Mediterranean experience. It's really really nice. So yeah, that's been that part, and it really has reinfused me with a scientific passion in a way, because by the end of my PhD, I was a bit burnt out from academia. I was not feeling like academia was gonna give me the satisfactions and the thrills that I was expecting 15 years before when I was a kid and I wanted to do science. So I decided that because my future was uncertain in academia, I wanted to set up something that was independent from academia, that would treasure and somehow protect and produce the environments that the best cases of academia produce, right? Which is the freely intellectual discourse, growth and discussion and cross-pollination between disciplines and so on. So it's been great.
Yeah, that's something often academia, I think, gets lost. So in the institutions themselves, so because they get very specialized, you have a lot of publishing pressure, and the free discussion association with people from other disciplines, it often dies a little bit
Yeah,
down.
unfortunately.
But that makes it more important to like connect and organize yourself, as you are doing.
Yes.
And unfortunately, I probably won't be able to join this year, time-wise, in person, the summer academy. But I hope you're still organizing one next year.
We should. Yes.
You should, depending on where you will be, right? Because right now you are planning to move to Ukraine.
Yes.
A complete like new chapter, and that's fascinating. Maybe let's move on to this topic. How do you move beyond this more and more broadening interdisciplinary research to now also becoming an activist or starting to become one?
Yes. That is the good question to answer in this podcast, I guess people, your listeners, would have formed a character of me right now, and then there's now a character progression, or even a plot twist in a way. In my view, not really. I have to say that even though I was very interested in the natural world, quote unquote natural in the classical sense of saying natural, let's say not non-human intervened world, Um, I was looking at clouds and animals,
Mm,
and
this is also maybe as an like subnote, isn't that a bit of an artificial distinction?
it absolutely is. That's why I said "quote unquote" or classical sense of natural. Uh, I am of no particular strong opinion that we should separate the natural or the artificial from the human, not human made or natural or whatever. I don't think that's a productive distinction. In sciences, you don't see that distinction anymore. This is
Yeah,
more in the public consciousness. This distinction is not made in science because obviously when you're doing a methodology and experimental setup, you don't care where the data is coming from. Data is data. Um, so so yeah, as I say, even though I was mostly interested in, let's say, non-human centric systems growing up,
mhm,
I was always very aware. I was interested in history. I like to know history. In a way, history is kind of the best explanation I had for the status quo of the world, the human world I lived in. So I liked this history, and I was quite aware of where things were coming from. I was aware that I
mhm,
was born in Spain, that Spain had the particular history, that we had a civil war that my grandparents went through, that we had a dictatorship where my parents were born, and I was very aware of all these, and I was aware that when I appeared in the world in 1991, we had an extremely uh, bonanza-like state in Spain, right? We had the boom of the 90s here, with a lot of development. I think the consequences of joining the EU was starting to
mhm.
come into full swing, and then generally it was the 90s, broadly speaking, not only in Spain, were a very uh, development-driven years for in the Western world, right? So
Yeah.
I lived that as a I enjoyed the produce of that a lot, right? I grew up. I always tell that the first video games I ever played were pixelated, really crappy looking things, and when I was a teenager, I was playing things that were almost photorealistic, right? So seeing that and you can apply that to many other things, to like cinema, to the industry, like even the book industry, the amount of diversity of books that you had available, it was just like complete game changer,
Yeah.
in the early 90s to the early 2000s. It was just quite a change. So all this development and all the actual architectural development I saw around, I what I'm sitting right now, when I was a kid, it was literally a field that was like just countryside. There was not
Mhm.
even like, it was not part of the city. And now this is completely urbanized and really well developed and beautiful and well planned. And so I think I was very aware of this, but I just didn't. It didn't fascinate me. Right, I was aware of it, so I knew that there were some forces and some factors that allowed it. So, in particular, the peace after World War II in Europe, the democratic transition in Spain in 1975, and all these different historical factors that made my life possible and made my life honestly like a movie-like experience, because I was able to dream of physics and science when I was a kid, then read Stephen Hawking, and then there I was a few years later meeting him in person, in Cambridge. It was really an amazing experience, and I am immensely grateful for this. I think it's
Mhm.
also good to exercise gratefulness and to think back of all the things you have good in your life. I think I've been extremely lucky as well, statistically speaking, personally, and so that also helps. So I was very aware of this. So going back to your question, how do we get here where I'm deciding to go to Ukraine? I have a campaign that I'm trying to fundraise for
Mhm.
armed forces people and defense of Ukraine and so on. Um, I think it all comes back to the actual. I think the biggest moment is the start of the full scale invasion. So,
Mhm.
late February 2022. I don't know if it was exactly on the 24th when the news broke, but it was probably a couple of days later at the most. I was looking at the news and thinking, wait a minute, there's a column of tanks heading to a European capital. What is happening? Like the
Yeah.
model of the world I had was completely wrong, at least for that part of the world. In my defense, I have to say that in my school years, we never got to 20th century history. It's a bit of a, when I say this to many of my European friends, they're a bit shocked, because in Europe, most places in Europe, the history is normally not presented linearly throughout the curriculum. In Spain, unfortunately, for maybe this might be a relic from the dictatorship days, who knows, we
Mhm.
actually don't get to the 20th century most of the time, because you just run out of time. So you literally begin in the Big Bang, and you
Yeah,
keep advancing, and you never really reach the 20th century. So let alone
yeah.
Eastern European history of the second half of the 20th century, that is never covered in.
That basically the mirror of like German history education I got, where basically you
Right.
barely leave Germany and you barely leave the 20th century because the curriculum is very focused on that.
Right. Right. Exactly. That's what I've heard from my friends from Germany and Austria. They basically do the mirror image of that. So I was quite ignorant of the reality over there. I
Hmm.
have to be completely honest. It was surprising, because I was just using a simplifying assumption that the patterns that I was observing in Spain or France or the UK, which were countries that I was familiar with, I was just applying more or less by extension to Eastern European countries, quite broadly, because I didn't know much about the differences in that respect between Poland and Ukraine and so on. I mean, I was just quite ignorant. I was not bothered with politics. I'm happy to admit that I'm still learning very much, and I didn't know a lot at the time. So I was very shocked. So that jolted me, and I was like, wait a minute. So I started reading and I started learning. That was my first reaction after the news. It was like, okay, I have to understand how we got here. And I have to say that after a few months that I kind of got up to speed with the information space,
Hmm.
my mind was very set up in a way. I was like, okay, this war seems to be has many components, but one of the principal components of the war is a uh, European leaning tendency in Ukraine that was at odds with a more Kremlin leaning tendency in Ukraine, and with sort of external dealings there and so on. Even though I didn't have a clear mind that I should become an activist and a supporter directly in that time, to me, the axis was kind of formed that anytime I saw aggression and attacks and all the war crimes that were reported and all those things, those all kind of piled up in an evidence chain. Not there were it
Hmm.
wasn't just scattered information that I was just trying to integrate. Um, and I have to say that I always, especially after the 2023 campaigns, where they were regaining a lot of the territory that they initially lost, I thought, okay, there's some hope. They're doing relatively well. We can, and then of course that didn't go that great. I mean, they had a lot of losses, but the front did get pushed back, and Kyiv was
Hmm.
all liberated and all that. So I did have a sense that, okay, this is now a matter of ending the war and finishing the problem, and somehow, right? So it kind of disappeared a bit from my mind. I still followed the news and so on, but then the second Trump term came around, and the whole Oval Office first Zelensky meeting with Trump
Yeah.
disaster happened and so on. Also, JD Vance's speech in Munich, all these things, they were quite jolting as well. Meaning,
Hmm.
okay, so there are no adults in the room when you assume that the US is kind of like the main strong arm of NATO, is doing this crazy stuff, right? Like if they're kind
Yeah.
of going off rails, I'm like, okay, this is not, this doesn't integrate into my previous model. So that was, I would say that was a moment around that time. So what was that? Early
Yeah,
24,
like early 2025. So it was a
early
great
25. That's right. Sorry.
moment for a lot of people, even people who were very active in politics and
Yes.
very involved in Ukraine before and European politics. Like I would say myself, this was like a shock moment. And I think it triggered like the zero patriotic
Yes.
wave of like outrage about the Americans abandoning us and
Mhm.
about also what's happening in Ukraine. A bit late, but one has to say, well, better late than never. And
Absolutely. Yes.
also, I think, as you said, with ignorance you described, or like lack of knowledge about the eastern half of Europe, um, I think even like in Germany, I think like 5 years ago, many Germans were very like they didn't really know anything east of Germany.
Mhm.
I met a lot of Germans, like even like in 2020, 2021, who thought like Poland is still a poor agricultural
Oh, yeah.
focused state. And when I show them, well, you have skyscrapers in Warsaw, an economy
Yes.
that is on the way to overtake the British one, at least on like a per capita basis. They were really like living in their own Western European bubble. And
Yes.
one of the good things about this whole tragedy of the Ukraine war is that this Western European bubble got pierced, and now I would say a lot of Western Europeans are way more confronted with what's going on in the East, and we Europeans are learning more from each other and more aware what is going on because we're developing like a pan-European discourse now because they were
Absolutely.
all affected by it and shocked, rightly so. So
And
you're, I
abs-
think, very typical for our generation in the sense of young Europeans realizing, well, there is something going on. This end of history Fukuyama promised us
yes.
isn't here.
Yeah.
Liberal democracy isn't a given, right?
Yeah. And just to hammer down that point you just made, I I I never knew of Fukuyama's end of history when I was younger, obviously, but I totally felt it.
Yeah,
I was part of the of the demographic that he was describing, because I thought this democratic development, this economic development is the natural. It's almost like the arrow of time of history, right? Like you would
yeah,
say in physics. Um, and and I was completely wrong. I never reasoned about it. I never argued that that was the case, but I had a sense that that was happening, and I made a lot of life choices based on like what
yeah,
career to
but it
do
makes
and
a
what.
lot of sense, right? I mean,
Yeah,
if
yeah,
you look like 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, it was a constant progress of like the communist dictatorships in the East crumbling away, the Berlin Wall went away, and then we
mm,
had this technological and globalization push, the
yeah,
internet came, there was prosperity, and at least in Europe, I mean, we didn't have like 9/11 or anything like that. You had the train bombings in Madrid,
yeah. We did it. Yeah,
but
yeah.
even like this war on terror was like a road bump on
It
the way
was
to a more prosperous and progressive and peaceful world. And
absolutely
it looked for like 3 decades like we are getting just more progressive and more prosperous all the time. And
totally.
then suddenly you have a war in Ukraine, and it changes, right? The
Yes, yes,
paradigm.
and of course, as you say, I think I am the kid of those 3 decades, right? Like I
Yeah.
was a person growing through those 3 decades, and in a also, as I said, very personally lucky story. So it gives me this perspective of like I I have no ties to Ukraine. I have no ties to Russia. I have no ties to Eastern Europe or Poland or anywhere in that part of the world.
Mhm.
I think our last common ancestor must be, hundreds and hundreds of years back with people from around there. Because I'm quite a local in the sense of the genealogies here. But the values that I perceive that were part of this development that we describe, right? I could see in the events playing out, right? In the Euromaidan, as I say, in Poland, right? Like the development that happened there, like the country sort of mm, totally taking the Western or let's say more Western European ways and making their own, and of course with all their idiosyncrasies and their local politics and everything.
Mhm.
But I think it's the pattern is real. It's not that the pattern was somehow misguided or not really there. But what I thought was the difference is that it's absolutely not a given. It's not something that comes for free. It
Yeah.
requires a lot of effort, and this is the part, the counterintuitive part that I was kind of in the slumber and I woke up, and so for me, when the second term came and all that, a year ago, basically, early 2025, a bit over a year ago, when I mean, not the second term, but the Munich conference and all
Yeah.
these events that happened in early 2025, um, I kind of made up my mind that I want to do something for Europe. My
Mhm.
first instinct was not to go to Ukraine. My first instinct was I want to do something for Europe. Uh,
Mhm.
I think Europe as an idea, not European Union necessarily, not the countries, like the geography, but Europe as an idea, the aggregated values, and this is a very complex, highly dimensional space that I don't pretend that in like 5 minutes of conversation here, even in this podcast, this is very appropriately branded, we can do justice to that. But the, the cluster of values, we might get into this later if you want, but the cluster of values that positive ones that I assign to Europe, the intellectual development, the social developments, the political developments in this continent in the last 2,000 years, have been, in my opinion, quite anomalous in history for planet Earth, for human history, and obviously there's good and bad. I mean, it's almost in equal measure, but you know, if you take out the bad, the good is really good in some sense.
Yeah.
Right? It's not to dismiss that the bad is possible. In fact, that's the main point, right? That the bad is really, really likely to happen if one is not hyper vigilant and hyper protective of the good. So, in some sense, I had this wake up moment of like, I'm in my early 30s. I'm gonna live through the Europe that gets built now, or unbuilt or destroyed. And if it's not me and my generation, who is going to do it, right? Like the people that are too young don't really have a concept of the consequence and scale of things, and the people who are older probably are more jaded or have less of an interest in some cases. But for people in our generation, roughly, we are at the highest stakes for this, right? Like we are all going to have children in this context. We are all if we want to live in Europe at all, we're going to experience what Europe becomes in the next phase, so to speak, right? So I had this very abstract, very non-concrete sense of, I want to do something for Europe. I don't know what that is. I don't know how my skills and abilities are going to be put to work towards the European idea. But I wanted to do it. It was very intuitive. I remember a car trip with my parents. We're going somewhere northern in Spain, and I was telling them about it for the first time, and that was a plot twist for that, because I was the scientist kid that they knew since they were like running around as a little kid, just saying, I want to be a theoretical physicist. And then suddenly I was coming out of nowhere saying, hey, Dad, did you see this J.D. Vance speech? That's pretty bad, right? It's like, I want to do something for Europe. It's like, oh, this sounds like a different kind of angle. But ultimately, they very much agreed. I mean, my parents are a great inspiration. They belong to this interesting mix of Catholicism and left-wing politics. So they are very progressive. They're both doctor and an engineer, very scientifically minded, not conservative at all. So it's this kind of progressive Catholicism, which I think has a lot of the good that Europe has produced, you know, in the sort of social development and the more highly moral and very integrating kind of perspectives. And anyway, but so they understood fully. And my point is that when I said this, that I was preaching to the choir in a sense, like they fully understood. They also felt extremely European. They all obviously voted for EU accession when back in the 80s and so on. So I was taken by this idea, but I had no concrete directions that I could follow. So going to Ukraine came more as a consequence of analyzing the specific geopolitics of what's going on, right? When I mean, at that time, I had the full information of what's going on, and you know the history of the Putin regime in Russia, and the whole you know broad strokes history of Ukraine and other Eastern European countries and so on, and with all its complexities and multivariable effects, I could basically draw an axis across the Ukraine-Russia border and say, you know, the ideas and values that are being preserved on the Ukrainian side are worth fighting for and are worth defending, because they represent in their pro-European reading, in their sort of Europe is behind you kind of interpretation, as the war, the kinetic war that is actually being fought on these values. In other countries like Spain or France or Germany or Poland, this war is at the political level, is at the disinformation level. It's a hybrid operations, other things, and not only against Russians, of course. It's about ideas that flow and parties that more or less align with Russia. But even if they don't, if their ideas are equally bad, they don't have a nationality. Bad ideas, unfortunately, don't have a nationality, and don't have an ethnicity. Like good ideas, they don't have an ethnicity or a nationality, right? So I see that as being so kinetic, as I say. It's very, very physical there, and that resonates with me because I'm a physicist that looks at the world. So when things get kinetic, it's like, this is something that I understand. So the specific story that why I ended up in this position for Ukraine is that some refugees came to Alicante. As probably your viewers might be aware, Spain took in quite a lot of refugees in 2022. So I became friends with a few Ukrainian people here in my hometown. And so that gave me sort of a point of contact. They were telling me how things were going because their parents were still back in Kyiv. And then eventually the moment came where one of my colleagues, whom I didn't know was Ukrainian, although now I should have guessed by the name, but at the time I thought, well, that's some Eastern European name. We typically don't ask where you're from when you're just collaborating, which is talking about science. So she's a mathematician. It's Olena Orlova. She's now doing the campaign with me. We were talking about science. She was coming to one of my summer schools in my society and so on. And then she mentioned, "Oh, I cannot travel because I'm in Kyiv. I'm visiting." This was last summer.
Mhm.
I was like, "Oh, you're in Kyiv. Oh, you must be Ukrainian." And so the conversation came through that. And she said, "Oh, I thought." So I told her, "Look, I'm becoming very sensitive towards this issue, and I'm kind of mobilized, right? I'm thinking of what to do more practically, especially as the war was kind of stagnating, and especially since you saw that maybe Western support was going to. I mean, there was a possibility it would collapse, right? I mean, and it kind of
Yeah.
did in a way for some weeks or months. So at that time, I thought, okay, I want to do something about it. And she said, well, the first thing we could do is just connect academic institutions. So she put me in contact with some mathematicians and some scientists in Lviv and Kyiv. And the first reaction was, hey, you should come and visit. And
Mhm.
especially to Lviv, because Lviv is, relatively quite safe. It's not that they are asking you to take a very, risky journey or anything. You just, so I thought, okay, that is interesting. I definitely wanted to go at some point. I didn't know it was going to be so early. As like the first time I meet them, I will say yes. But I said yes. I said okay, yeah, let's go. Let's try to
Mhm.
figure it out. And so I visited Lviv and Kyiv back in December, so December 2025. And that experience just was everything. Because once you go there, if I already had these ideas that I wanted to do something for Ukraine, after you see Maidan Square with all the flags, I had the particular story that I arrived there at the time, early in the morning, at the time they were doing the minute of silence. And so the whole city stops. All the cars in the middle of the road, they all stop. It was very impressive, right? It was a very, very breathtaking moment. So, and of course, there had been attacks overnight. So when I arrived in Kyiv on the train, there were full families all in the station underground and everything, right? So it was I was lucky that nothing happened. I mean, I didn't hear explosions myself. I didn't, nothing happened to
Mhm.
me during the weekend I stayed in Kyiv, but it was a very impactful experience. I stayed with the family that my friend's parents that live in Eastern Kyiv. So it was very shocking. Of course, I knew the numbers, I knew the facts. I didn't learn anything new when I was there, but it was shocking to just take a car ride from the train station to their apartment. And they weren't even pointing at anything. I was just looking out the window. I would see holes in the ground. I would see impacts in buildings. I mean, not everywhere, right? But this is not one off. It's definitely going on, as we know, right? If people are following the news, this is what happens there. So the fact that they are living with this reality and they have this determination, it was just super impactful for me, right? It was really I want to do something, and so I could say more about my trip to Ukraine. We can maybe get
Yeah.
into that later if you want. But to answer your question of how did I come to become an activist, basically, and to be
Yeah.
waving my hand, say, "Hey guys, I'm going to Ukraine. I have a fundraiser." It happened on the way back from Kyiv when I was heading to Poland on the train already. That was the beginning of the winter campaign of strikes against the energy infrastructure. So I think some Iskander missiles fell in one of the stations that were supplying
Yeah.
the train that I was on. So we got stranded in the middle of nowhere for like 4 hours. We did have power in the train because batteries, I guess, but it was quite, you know in the middle of nowhere, all dark, and you're just there. You don't know what's going on because the announcement was in Ukrainian. I didn't understand why we were. I assumed that it was the case, but I learned later that it was because of the attacks. And during that time, I was thinking, I was processing everything I had seen and all the conversation I had with my Ukrainian colleagues and friends, and I resolved to do something for Ukraine. I didn't know what exactly, but I resolved that I'm going to. What I mean is, I resolved to move to Ukraine. That's what I meant.
Hmm.
I wanted to go there and do something on the ground. Mostly also because I learned that this was part of the search online and everything, that there's not much you can do from outside Ukraine other than donate and maybe provide information coverage, right? I think outside of those two, there's not much else one can do. I mean, sure, you can try to help culturally, scientifically, you can collaborate. There's many dimensions that one can, but really, if you're trying to tackle the emergency and the situation, which doesn't feel like an emergency because it's ongoing for such a long time, but it's still quite pressing. It seems to be only to donate, support fundraising and support financially, support the actual effort from outside, or help in the information space to
Mm.
share the
So
good information and so on.
that's
Because of that
already,
reality,
yeah.
I decided, okay, I will move in here because I want to put my brain and able body to to helping with the situation. And at that point, I had no idea if that was going to be because I would become a scientist here and a teacher and teach at the university as I used to when I was in Edinburgh, or if I was going to try and help with defense and solve some problems. I have since learned that brains have thought about mathematical problems are very useful for air defense and the very difficult problems they are trying to solve with managing the highly complex multi-layered systems they have to deal with the highly complex multi-layer attacks they are experiencing, right? So it's so this is still being formed, exactly what I would do there. I'm now kind of in that direction of probably, inserting myself into some contexts where mathematically inclined brains might be useful. So that's
Hmm.
part of the plan. But in a way, that's secondary. For me, the first step, as my Ukrainian colleagues have told me, the first step is to get there. So in my move there, what I'm doing is I'm trying to raise as much awareness, especially in Spain, which has a particularly bad case of information space, lack of news and lack of good information from Ukraine. And then, yeah, if we can support this particular people, this particular Ukrainian defenders with a truck and some equipment, some supplies, that's a bonus in some sense. So I am trying to focus on that in the first few months, and hopefully in August or late July, I should be there.
Hmm. So you're preparing right now to head to Kiev in like 1 or 2 months.
That's right. That's right. So I have some work to do
Hmm.
in the US. So that would be my last geographically binding commitment that I have to do in July. But after that, as soon as I'm back, I will. There's nothing else I'm doing. That I mean, I have to be in Valencia for my summer school. That is kind of on the same weeks as I'm traveling for work. And then right after that's done, which is mid July, I will basically drive over to Ukraine.
Hmm. And do you have already a plan right now what you will exactly do step by step, or for how long you want to stay there?
As I said, the current plan is quite high level in the sense that the way I see the plan is there's this phase of the fundraiser right now where
Mhm.
because I mean, the decision came because some friends told me, oh, if you're going to Ukraine, I would like to support you and to maybe donate. And
Mhm.
I initially didn't even have the instinct to run a fundraiser. But because some friends said that, I said, oh, that makes sense. And then I was also thinking, how am I going to travel there if I have to carry like my office and my remote office? Because my plan, by the way, is to continue to do research work from
Mhm.
Ukraine. I am in a very privileged position where my grant allows to work remotely. This is very uncommon for academic grants or scientific
Yeah.
grants. So I would make full use of this flexibility to just relocate to Kyiv in the nearest future, the expectation is that whatever I'm doing in Madrid, day after day, I wake up, I go to um, my home office and then come back, and it's the regular routine I can do in Kyiv. So at the very least, that is the same. So the plan is first move there. So because I have to drive there, let's take a truck that I will donate to Ukrainian defenders. So these are people who are connected. If people check the link that will be in the description, or will be shared
Yeah.
otherwise easily accessible. These are people that are connected to Olena. Olena is my collaborator and colleague, and good friend, and she's connected to these defenders who are involved in um, different functions in the near
Hmm.
the front lines and in the armed forces. So we contacted them. We discussed with them, what do you need? And as unsurprisingly, as if people who are aware of this space, the main need are trucks, because these are expendable, basically. So pickup trucks, big cars, big civilian cars, they are very expendable because they reinforce them, and some drones fall on them. Uh, Hopefully, people don't die. They only get hurt maybe, and then they evacuate, and then the cars are destroyed because a couple more drones fall on them, and they are no longer usable.
Yeah.
So they are quite expendable. It's quite expendable
It's
material.
still quite expensive, right?
It is quite
Or it's a
expensive.
high burn rate.
Yes, but unfortunately, that equipment is critical because they needed to
Mm.
rotate people to perform all kinds of operations. I mean, I haven't looked at the figures very recently, but at some point I saw the statistics that a very high percentage of casualties were happening in between rotations, right? So not really in active combat or in some big strikes, but really when people were moving between positions, they were being handed down by drones in the gray zone, right? So so the cars are crucial for that, because if you have a good reinforced car, you can probably soak up one impact of a drone, and then people can quickly take cover and think of evacuation. So that's the main objective. The second part of the fundraiser, so that's one half of the fundraiser. The second half of the fundraiser is equipment to defend against drones. So the other person listed on the fundraiser, he is involved in communications infrastructure. So particularly, all the intelligence that goes on when there are air raids, and different flying objects are entering Ukraine space. We are providing some material to he requested specific items, specific routers and specific IT material that can help with that particular mission. So if people want to think of the campaign in some conceptual way, the idea is to defend as much as possible the lives of the civilians and the lives of the defenders that are fighting right now in Ukraine, because I understand that morally people might have issues like funding actual kinetic weapons and all that stuff, which from a strategic point of view, we can argue that it actually might be better, or might be, it's a different thing. But I understand that as a fundraiser, what you would be funding for every cent that goes into that uh, fundraiser is preserving lives of civilians and preserving lives of defenders with the cars, and being able
Hmm.
to perform operations safely, right? So I think that's why I decided eventually to do it, because as I said, that was not my initial idea. My initial idea was just to drive into Ukraine and maybe donate whatever car I drove there myself. But then I realized, wait, let's make it into an awareness campaign that is trying to protect lives. So yeah, that's the main focus now. In terms of when I get there, answering your question, uh, I don't really have a specific plan. I have been told, I have a specific plan of what to do to find the next steps, but the next steps are not defined yet. So I have been told, as I said, that mm, I have to get on the ground. I have to know the people there. It is understandable that the information space needs to be kept fairly confined in Ukraine. It's understandable that you can't just participate in strategically relevant operations from outside Ukraine, just remotely, online, freely, because I mean, that's not the safest for the operations itself, probably, right? So
Yeah.
I have a lot of contacts. I'm gonna be I'm connected to several people who are in similar positions that were Europeans that moved into Ukraine at some point during the invasion. So I think uh, I'm well mentored in this direction. I think I will insert myself in relevant environments. And yeah, I I'm not particularly worried that oh, maybe I don't find. So I plan to assess the situation by December next year.
Hmm.
So the plan is to be there at the very least until, let's say, the holiday break over winter, um, and then assess the situation. And then
Yeah.
if I have found a place and context where I can be useful from Kyiv, then I will come back after the holiday break, and I will stay there for as long as necessary. That's kind of the answer I'm
Hmm.
giving people. The short answer is, how long are you going to Ukraine? And yeah, my answer is always, as long as it's necessary, right?
Yeah.
I have no deadlines or because I mean it's a war. You
Yeah.
can't.
You don't know when it will end,
Yeah,
unfortunately. And I mean, I find that very inspiring and also a smart move because the best, you can only, I think, allocate resources and money and time efficiently when you are there. From the outside, I think if you're not in Ukraine, the best thing you can do is do some online advocacy work in general, support Ukrainian diaspora, or donate. And because if you donate the money, the people who are in Ukraine know the best how to use it and for what to
yeah,
use it. So I find that very honorable and very great that you are moving there. And I think once you are there, you will figure out the most efficient ways to help beyond bringing trucks and creating awareness. But
yes,
speaking of awareness, how is it going in Spain regarding the awareness of the war? Because we had also some short talks. You also had you created some YouTube videos some while ago, and with your campaign, you're also trying to create some awareness in Spain. Because
yes,
the Iberian Peninsula, I think both Spain and Portugal, because we are geographically so far away from Ukraine, the people, unfortunately, if you look at the map, don't care as much over there as, for example, people in Poland or Romania who even get sometimes drones
right,
flying over the border.
right.
Um, so how is the state in Spain? Maybe look on the other side in Europe. How is
Yes.
going pan-European solidarity with Ukrainians?
Right, right. Thanks for the question. I think that's actually when people look at the campaign, they will see that that's one of the main points of action. I mean, the campaign has 3 points of action. One is the fundraiser proper, where we are supporting defense with the truck and equipment and whatnot. The second point is for me to go physically there as my current persona, the scientist persona, the academic persona, so that we connect Ukraine's scientific community with some of our networks that are more international. And then the third one is precisely to inject the Spanish-speaking information sphere. And let's say, the Iberian and the Peninsula and Latin America in general, right?
Hmm.
Because I was very shocked when I started to think about this project. I got online and started to do some searches and uh, find people that were covering the conflict, because obviously my understanding of the conflict has come through English speaking people that were covering the conflict. It was quite good, I think, the information space in English. I thought, okay, there might be something up to scale equivalent in Spanish. It turns out there isn't. As the short story is, there isn't. I shouldn't like, oh, there's something. No, no, no. Really, there is not a analog of that. Okay, fair. There's a couple of geopolitics channels in Spain that report on Ukraine very well, in my opinion. Their reports are very accurate, very succinct and to the point, and they're really doing a great job. But these are geopolitics channels. So these are channels that have, you know, 20 videos, and one of them will be about Ukraine because it's another geopolitical theater. Of course, we have Iran, we have, the US doing a bunch of crazy things around the world. We have China, we have many things that are relevant, right? Not only Ukraine. But so I couldn't find anyone on the ground reporting, which is something that you see much more in English. And more to my surprise and my despair, when I searched on YouTube specifically, war in Ukraine, or I don't know, Russia, Ukraine war or something in Spanish, I got basically one channel. There was a big channel with tens of thousands of views every day, and I think a few 100,000 subscribers. Good looking lady just speaking to the camera. And I get into it, it's like, wait a second, this says geopolitics, it says kind of covering news and so on. But then after a couple of videos, you realize, okay, this is Russian propaganda, basically, right? So it was very disheartening because it is the sophisticated version of propaganda. It is even sometimes sounding critical of the Kremlin, but it's nonetheless fully. When you integrate the 2 weeks long amount of information that gets sent out, it is completely Russian filtered. I mean, she's Russian and she's living in Donbass on the other side. So you get exactly
many such cases.
Yes. So she speaks very good Spanish. She speaks with a Castilian accent. She's has a very natural. If you don't know she's Russian, and you probably wouldn't assume it immediately. And it's very disheartening because she's getting tens of thousands of views every day. So there is already, out there, I'm not a YouTuber, so if any of the listeners want to take up the challenge, and Spanish-speaking listeners want to take up the challenge to dethrone this channel as the main information source about the war, because it is, right? Right now, this is the biggest Spanish-speaking channel that speaks about the war in Ukraine every day, right? So it's very disheartening because I don't know how. I don't think it has a lot, by the way, I don't think it has a lot of impact in the Spanish community overall. Spain, geographically Spain, because I think her base is more in Latin America and other places. But it's very disheartening that the biggest channel by far that covers this topic is giving you this completely distorted version of, because as I say, she's not blatantly pro-Kremlin and a fanfare kind of propagandist, which I think are quite ineffective. It is the kind that is sort of equidistant and then mostly equidistant. And then when it really matters, it is clearly, pro-Kremlin. Russia has to be much harsher on Ukraine. Why are they not launching missiles to Kyiv? Why are they not destroying the decision-making centers? Like all the talking points that are, on vogue and fashionable at the moment, she throws in between actual news, right? So anyway, so that's just an anecdote, but the answer is, if that can thrive, it means that the information space is very sparse, right? I get, for example, I'll give you literally yesterday, you might remember there was this naval drone that got into the Romanian port, and that was the kind of like, it went off course and it arrived in the port and it had to be detonated controllably, right, with big explosion. So the Ukrainian forces warned Romania, and they collaborated, and everything was okay. No big issue, right? So here in the news, there was some mainstream news yesterday going on the TV. The information is so sparse, and they are so not used to reporting on this, that they were talking about how a maritime drone fell in Romania. It's like, do you even look at the words you're using? Maritime drone fell. How can that happen, right? So they couldn't. The person writing that and the person reporting on that probably didn't even know what they were talking about. They were just got some report, they translated it into Spanish or whatever, and they just put it out. And because linguistically, it didn't even make sense.
Most likely, it wasn't even a person, but just an AI translator.
Yeah. Let's say an agent of some kind,
just
human
took
or
some
not.
newsfeed and translated it to Spanish.
Right. But my point is that the person, there's a human eventually reading the message, or the news director eventually, someone reads that, and then millions, because that channel has millions of viewers, millions will listen to that. What do you make of that when you say naval run fell? That's just not even a Spanish language sentence that can make any sense, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, it's just an anecdote, but the information space is essentially empty, right? There's no,
Mhm.
and in fact, it is kind of weird that because it's so rarefied and so empty, and so sparse, the Russian talking points penetrate more often than in others information spaces, because they are absolutely not ready to analyze news pieces with a kind of grain of salt that people who are more in this information space understand. So it's not to say that everything that comes from Russia is all false and all that, obviously, right? But it's when yesterday they said or 2 days ago they said, oh, there have been some attacks in a high school in occupied Donbass by Ukraine, which is technically correct. But of course, it was a training center and it was a military target, right? So it's this kind of pieces of information that they don't get fully clarified. It is news that Ukraine has launched an attack that seems to be more cruel or less military oriented than in the past. Let's just flag it because it's different from the norm, which is that Ukraine is largely targeting economic production sites or military sites and things like that, right? So it is very rarefied. It's very my expectation is I want to get into contact with like news sources and journalists here and so on, because the journalists that are actually doing the work, they are very good. So it's not, I'm not trying to, disparage the work of journalists who actually cover the conflict, because when they do, the coverage is great. I don't have any criticism for the actual work. The problem is that the information space is empty. Basically, as you say, we are in the other end of Europe, which is in some sense kind of a romantic thing for me, that I'm literally crossing the whole of the continent to get there. So yeah, it's a complicated situation with information
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great show, you personally, that you have this pan-European solidarity. But I mean, I myself, I don't know much about Spanish politics in detail. I know that also. I read some news headlines we had in Germany. I don't know how serious we want to. I should take them. Where was will Sanchez become the new Orban? Question mark. We had a few days ago
What?
because he's apparently close to China.
Yes. This we can talk about. I understand.
But
Um,
I think from what I understood, it was not related to Ukraine.
no, not at all.
No,
Not at all
not
related to
just to
Ukraine.
China.
No. Spain, I have to say, I feel I'm going to say two pieces on this point, on Spanish politics.
Mhm.
I'm not following super closely. I'm not very engaged with it, but the broad
No, am I.
strokes that affect the Ukraine war and so on, I'll say two pieces. The first one, a hopeful one, and second one connected to this article, probably more worrying. The first is that a month ago or so, I was following some Ukraine updates from I can't remember what channel it was, some
Mhm.
Ukrainian state news that are reporting on like diplomacy and so on, and they said, thanks to the Spanish Ministry of Defense, that they gave us 100 armored trucks. Right, they donated 100 armored trucks. So I was like, oh, that's fantastic. I mean, so Spain, I have to say, has been quite supportive of the war. I think for a country that is so far away, that has basically not immediate geopolitical stakes.
Yeah. I think
In
financial support was quite substantial.
Yes, financial support and military support, both in terms of equipment and training and so on. So I think my country, I'm not going to go to my, MPs and try to pressure them on. I think Spain is quite, uh, institutionally, let's say, right, at a political level and the state level, they are doing great. And the anecdote I wanted to say is that after that news came out, the day after, I had a trip towards the north of Spain from Madrid, and I was on the highway and I literally saw the trucks carrying some of these armored trucks. So I was like, okay, so that's a good feeling. I see the news one day and the next day I see trucks literally going through the Pyrenees to take it to Ukraine, right? So it was a very hopeful moment. It was like, wow, I felt proud of whatever person in government that made these decisions, like the chain of decision that was made, because it was real. Like they promised 100, the Ukrainian government confirmed it. And then the next day they were on the way. Right. So it was very,
Mm.
very hopeful to see. Now, the second point about the current Spanish government is that Pedro Sanchez went to China, I think like 2 months ago or something like that. There was a state visit that happened.
I think he has been every
And
year there, hasn't been? I think since he's president, he was in China every year,
oh
actually.
yeah, 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 for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's visited regularly. I was not paying so much attention the previous years, but this year I did. And then on my feed comes the speech that he gave at some university. Can't remember which university it was. It was like a 15-minute um, speech. I was
Mm.
like, well, I'm going to listen to this speech just in whole. I don't want to see headlines. I just want to get it directly from him. Um, I have to tell you, I'm not particularly against this president. I'm not particularly in favor of this president. I'm sort of a bit lukewarm. It's kind of very charismatic, very left leaning. It's quite captured by the sort of for further left parties, but overall, I don't think he's terrible and like
Mhm.
horrible as some people claim to be. There's all these corruption scandals going on around him right now, which are, if true, bad, but it's not like catastrophically bad. It's not
Yeah.
sure. There's some kind of corruption, but it's like more meddling with investigations and things like that, other than a big scandal, at least so far. Um, but anyway, so I'm listening to this speech, and I'm thinking, I don't even recognize that this is the Spanish president. Like in a way that he's praising China as a state in a way that feels almost like propagandistic, right?
Mhm.
He's referring to the greatness in the past, to the greatness of the nation. So these talking points that you've heard many times, like pro China information pieces, and I was very shocked because at one moment he says, and we will not agree on everything, and he gives this slight counterpoint of, we come from Europe in very democratic country and so on. The word, obviously, the word democracy didn't show up at all in that in that speech, of course, and the word, and it was all about how we want all to see this great nation become greater again, and
Mhm.
it was very strange. It really did not feel like a speech I would ever hear from a Spanish president. Not
Mhm.
right, left, or anyone. It was quite a bizarre experience. So this is a big question mark for me. I have to say I haven't my geopolitical knowledge on the China relations with Europe is very limited. But it worries me. It
Yeah.
definitely it is a worrisome prospect, because this embracing of diplomacy with China seems a bit out of character for. I mean, this is one of the problems that this particular president has, which is that when there are causes that seem popular at a given moment, they're
Mhm.
very quick to kind of go all in and say, "Oh, this is." It's like with Gaza or with other causes, they go all in very quickly, and they, instead of keeping sort of a more um, tempered, sort of middle ground, skeptical almost view, which I think is more healthy, right?
Mhm.
Uh, so yeah, unfortunately, there's that's I guess that's part of the Spanish character. Spanish character is very humanitarianly driven. So whenever there is suffering, you can expect a response from the Spanish society.
Which is a
But
good
at the
thing.
same time, when which is great, of course, but at the
Yeah.
same time, it's very passionate, right? So so when things, it's sometimes hard to be in the rational center if you are in Spain, because things get very passionate very quickly.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, I understand, but it is actually true. I mean, it is. I think it's a pattern that you actually observe, that
Mhm.
Spanish people tend to be extremely charitable when there are humanitarian crises. They're very willing to give and willing to get involved, but it's a very social society. I mean, if that makes sense, right? It's
Yeah.
very, they have very, very strong social base. Even though there's all these immigration problems that people talk about, and they are real in some dimension, integration here is amazing. I mean, there's a lot of integration from African immigrants, and that's the norm more than the extremes.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is you get a personality, average personality kind of thing, geopolitical personality that it's a bit hard to reason with in some sense, right?
Mm.
It's hard to sit down and say, look at the facts, look at all the great complexity there's here. We need to plow through intellectually to come out on the other side with something actionable. That's difficult to do. Uh,
Yeah.
when the causes are clear, like the one in Ukraine, support is unwavering. Like, oh yeah, we know we are on the Ukrainian side. There's no question. Um, Other than confusion with early Russian uh, propaganda, but I think this was mostly the Western world in general. It wasn't specific to Spain. That
Yeah.
all these beliefs that, oh, maybe NATO had something to do, and there were talking points of like NATO expansion and all this very
Uh,
weird. Yeah, but this was very very early on. Since
yeah.
then, it's been quite clear.
I mean, talking like rationally and dispassionately about politics, I think, is getting harder and harder nowadays everywhere, because
Yeah,
especially social media and the entire how nowadays the algorithms works that they reward outrage and rage and passion. It's not very conductive to a very healthy discourse.
right.
Um,
So maybe
oh,
this is something I wanted to ask you. Do you imagine? Because I love what you just said that in general it's getting harder. Do you imagine the European space in particular finding some kind of hack of this system so that rationality can enter politics again? This is a big question, but I want to know your opinion on that.
I think a good thing about Europe is that we have very strong civil society, and in general, I think on average, not as polarized yet. So you
Mhm.
can still reverse a lot. But what we have to change is, I think, how we interact with, especially digital media,
Mm.
and also how we regulate tech platforms. Because I think a lot of this polarization we see nowadays and agitation is also to a certain degree manufactured. In the sense that, for
Yeah.
example, TikTok or Meta with Instagram or X with Elon Musk, they know quite well that if they tune their algorithms to reward the biggest outrage, they maybe make more money and have more engagements, but they also disrupt the society. I
Yeah.
think in cases like TikTok, China knows quite well how disruptive TikTok is for the civil discourse. That's also why, for example, TikTok itself is not available in China. They have a
Right.
different app there. And there has been also instances where it's proven how the algorithm is tailored to amplify certain content that is
Mm.
polarizing. The Russians also did on purpose polarizing operations. For example, we had, for example, this Black Lives Matters riots in America like 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And what Russia basically did, it organized one Facebook group that was called like Black Lives Matters Portland, and then one group about irgendwie Patriots Portland. Both Facebook pages were managed by the same Russian agency, and they
Wow.
both organized when protests and counter protests to just rally the people against each other, to polarize society.
Right.
They were being both sides, the right and the left, were like amplified the hatred by the Russians to just cause polarization and discontent, and I think we in Europe struggle right now to protect our democracies against that, because we have this like, well, we have free speech and everything, and we want to maintain that. But at the same time, we also don't own these platforms, and
Yeah.
we are very vulnerable to this algorithmic manipulation. And it will be very hard to find a balanced solution. I think in the long run, we will have to regulate social media stronger. And
Mm.
here actually, Spain is doing some few good things, like, for example, banning social media for people younger than 16. That's something that Sanchez did, which I think is good, because the older you are, um, the more you have developed the cognitive faculties
Yeah.
to not get completely addicted and addicted to, especially to this the algorithmic content streams,
Yes.
and
Yes.
can like, engage with it more healthily. But in the long run, we will have to take more actions. But it's
Hmm.
one of the big challenges, I would say, of the 21st century.
Yeah. And I think it's also kind of intellectually interesting to me because this idea that you might have actors like Russia or maybe China. China, I think it might be a bit more contentious that they are very deliberately doing that. In the case of Russia, you've just given an example that is very explicit.
Yeah,
Um,
the Russian propaganda is more into your face often.
yes, yes, but I think what's very interesting is that we are observing this phenomenon, and this might be very well studied in the political sciences and social sciences communities. But my ignorance here is showing. Um, but this phenomenon of like you don't have so much a war of ideas like in the past, where I mean, in the past, I mean like forever, since there's been ideas being discussed and written about. Uh, you have like factions, right, that are coming and going and, pushing for different things, like one Catholics and the Protestants and, the different religions, different political parties, communism and, liberalism, all these things. Um, and now it's kind of different, right? Because you're having agents that are promoting uh, basically the polarization of that idea space, right? Is they're
Yeah.
promoting a certain kind of dynamics within the idea space instead of specific ideas within that space.
Hmm.
I find that fascinating because it really requires a different tool set to tackle, right? If that is endangering the values that we want to keep in Europe, and democratic stability and all this independence of institutions and um, some degree of rationality in the discourse. Uh,
Hmm.
the tools that you apply to that are different than counter propaganda, right? For example, right?
Yeah.
One way to tackle like bad ideas is to try to make good ideas more visible. Of course, this has been a forever method. But now, if you have agents banking on some kind of second order strategies, right, where
Mm.
you're going one layer up and you're saying, I don't really care about the specifics of the contents of the ideas. All I care about is that those ideas, if they are sufficiently disorbitant, they are going to stress your institutions from the inside, and they are going to rip them apart. And I think the U.S. right now is a very important extant case, right? Because
Yeah.
I mean, what we are observing is really anomalous, right? I mean, we are very used to it because it's Trump and it's been 10 years since it's been doing crazy stuff, but it's really quite anomalous, right? What we're observing is like I mean, in some cases, it's worse than these like idiocracy movies and so on, right? It really is like charlatans and really ill-fitted people in extreme responsibility positions, right? So I think that should be a warning call of saying, a tendency is happening. I don't know how much it has to do with the complexity of the system and as an emergent phenomena,
Hmm.
and how much of it is a deliberate strategy by agents that want some gain out of that. But in either case, it is a force that is happening. In either case, it's a pattern that is going on. And I think it's, as you say, in Europe, one of our challenges for the 21st century, for sure. I agree.
Yeah. I would say the problem here is that we had for a long time this very enlightened notion of a rational deliberation, public deliberation of discourse, of people judging ideas on their merit. But the
Mm,
problem, like both from malicious actors, but also like structurally how like modern communication networks function on social media, is that they incentivize a lot the bypassing of reason. So, for example, I mean, the human brain is not a perfectly rational
no.
machine. It has a lot of shortcuts, a lot of heuristics, as we know from behavioral economics, to
Yeah.
just save energy and save cognitive resources, because makes sense evolutionary, right? Sometimes you have to just make a fast decision, and especially and situations that involve perceived danger or like certain social things, we have a lot of like mental shortcuts that like nudge us into a certain decision, and they override rational parts of our brain. And that's exploited a lot by social media algorithms and propaganda. For example, one of like very primitive instincts every human has is, for example, a certain degree of xenophobia. Because,
Yeah.
I mean, strangers are always a little bit scary. From
Yep.
in a Stone Age setting, if you saw someone from a different tribe, you didn't know what kind of diseases they carried, what were their intentions. To be a little bit afraid of strangers is completely rational.
Yeah.
Um, but what happens is then, for example, on social media, Europe is very safe. If you look at the numbers, we have a fifth of a homicide rate of the United States. Europe is the safest place on Europe. But if you go on X, and you get spammed by some Russian accounts showing you immigrant violence, like Europe is descending into some migrant invasion and violent Afghans, Syrians are stabbing everyone in the back valleys.
Mm.
People get really like it shuts off the fear that this induces. The instinct shuts off the rational parts of the brain,
Yeah.
and then you have this very emotional response, which
Yeah.
is completely detached from reality. People get bombarded with like videos, images that trigger this instincts and bypass reason. And then they are living in like a parallel reality. And this is the right wing populists especially use that a
Yeah.
lot there. Basically, if you look at the numbers and you look out of your window, if I go through Munich or ever European city, it's perfectly safe. But if
Yeah.
you're someone who's like a lot of online, you think Europe is descending into some deep crime crisis, and that's
Yeah.
getting exploited a lot by the right wing populists, who ironically often are very pro Russia, where Russia is bombing Syria and Libya and pushing all the migrants to us. So, like, it's a self reinforcing
Yeah.
propaganda campaign that tears apart our democracy and our ability to like also have a reasonable discourse, and
Yeah.
that's very very toxic.
Mm.
And the Russians are unfortunately very good at sowing and destroying this toxicity. The Chinese are more in the strategies. Actually, they try to influence and shape a positive image of China. They have a very hegemonial strategy. They want to buy their way in, be respected, and so on. But the Russians are just basically blowing up our democratic discourse and trying to damage us from within. And that's
Yeah.
very insidious. And they're unfortunately very successful with it.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely. I think it's interesting to just to kind of tie it a bit with the narrative that I was referring to earlier in
mm,
the podcast about growing up in such a um, idyllic kind of
yeah.
setting, right? Um, in some sense, the question for me is how. I mean, goes back to the values of, for example, education, right? If you grow up in a place that is largely safe, you're not being attacked, but you still know that tragedies happen. You still know that there are problematic individuals. You still know that um, even there are policies that are bad that need to be changed, even if the society at large is wonderful, right?
Mm,
And so if you can spend the time to find causalities and try and build a model or a framework to think about those, um, then and then obviously that has to be done at a societal level. It's not the individual because the individual is probably too busy with their problems and too psychologically unable to spend the time one afternoon to say, I'm going to think why this guy got stabbed the other day and got on the local news, and or my friend told me this anecdote where he got stopped by migrants on the street or something. Which those things do happen because I
yeah.
remember way before social media when I was younger, these stories were still here, like 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I could still hear these stories of, oh, there was a black dude doing this, or there was this Algerian guy that did that, or whatever. And it was similar in shape to what you see today. Of course, now it is algorithmically superpowered,
Yeah.
and it's much more problematic because of that. Um, so, but the psychological processes were very similar, right? Like when you got one story, the community that where that story spread became hyper vigilant for that pattern, not acknowledging that. the rational thing to do is to basically discard it as a fluke and not assume that something was wrong with the system, right?
Yeah, or not assume it as it being the normal, right?
Exactly. So anyway, the way I wanted to circle back to our original talking points
Yeah.
on what makes me how do I feel European, or what I feel in Europe is that um, it is I have a deep sense of hope that we're going to solve these problems. Like I am very optimistic by nature. So I should say this as as a disclaimer, right? It's not that I've studied a lot for 2 years and now have a thesis that says I'm hopeful we're going to solve these problems, but I am quite hopeful that the European society, in a
Mhm.
very large sense, is going to solve these issues because um, in some sense, let's not put it optimistically. Let's just put it realistically, which is we either disappear as an entity. The idea of
Mhm.
Europe disintegrates, or we're actually going to solve those problems. So
Yeah.
I'm not assigning probabilities to those two outcomes, but I think it's one of the two. And the reason I say that is that I cannot imagine a future where Europe's still a thing, and we see blue flags with stars waving somewhere across this continent of some kind. That and the values that we assign, we appreciate, are not somehow upheld and kept to some degree,
Mm.
because um, everywhere I look, and I have I don't have a massive social life in across Europe, but I do have a lot of friends in, I think, every single European country. In the like, I know at least one person directly in every single European country. Um, Everywhere I look, I see a very consistent pattern. It's either the people who veer away from the Gaussian center of European values, which is definitely a distribution. It's not like a
Yeah.
a monolithic thing. But the ones that really go to the tails of that normally are extremely self-centered. They isolate in bubbles that might be very energized by disinformation and all this like polarization going on. But when they get there, they're quite isolated, right? They end
Mm.
up being might be isolated with other thousands of or hundreds of thousands of isolated people that they all communicate, but in a way they are atomizing, right?
Yeah.
They become, to a degree, ostracized. They become sort of weird and say, oh, that person is kind of extremist, right? And that's why I have to say I don't have a lot of knowledge of other societies than really the Spanish one and maybe the British one that I lived there. Um, but in those two societies, I see a very similar pattern, which is that um, the social values, the social cohesion in the base is extremely strong.
Yeah.
And I've seen episodes of, even when the political tension is high and the stakes are high and people are really betting on really dramatic changes that for economics and for things like that, and they get very heated personally and they're attacking each other and so on. I've consistently seen friend groups that are consistently across political spectra in
Mhm.
in in, in Spain specifically, right? There's this usual uh, like saying here that people say, um, we're going to, I know how to translate it, but it's basically something like we're going to fight on the politics, but then we'll go to the bar and have a beer. It's
Yeah.
it's like the expression is quite stronger in Spanish. It's something like we're going to tear each other apart in politics, like very violently, and then we're going to go to the bar and have a beer, right? So this, I think, I mean, it's very cliche as well, but it is really quite a reality. Like, society is integrated in this way. You have, in my friend group, in my group of friends from childhood, there are people who are quite clearly on the right, very conservative, very economically liberal, and so on. And there are people who literally voted for the Communist Party at some point and are working in like left like far left propaganda machines even, right? And these are extremely good friends. They get together. They I mean, they are extremely close, right? And we are all good friends together. So that gives me a lot of hope, right? It's like, okay, we're going to find something where this a structure of a society that we use as a social glue, it's going to carry us into solutions, right? And to be fair, if I go to Ukraine and I try to do something useful for these values, it's because I've seen them in action, and I
Mm.
think they are the best way that a society can lift itself up. Because obviously, all the institutions are important, and we have to build. We have to, as some people are saying, we have to take the best from the Chinese way of administering this or that, the best from the American this or that, like the entrepreneurship kind of environments and so on. Like you really have to be open-minded of like what are actually the best solutions. But the things that you already know are extremely valuable and core, those
Mm.
you have to like say, yeah, this is going to go forward, right? So in the sense of humility, right? It's not like, oh, anything that's coming from China will always be bad or something like that. Of course not, right? Like you have to be critically assess it, and if it's an experiment that is being run there for 50 years, and you obviously don't want to have a regime anything like the Chinese regime, but you've seen experiments there that tell you, valuable lessons of how things might work. Of
Yeah.
course, if it's even if it's referred to as a Chinese model of something, that's not necessarily bad, right? Like it needs to, for example, just as a quick comment, I think the entrepreneurial infrastructure in the U.S. is really strong,
Yeah.
right? It really is. They have run an experiment for many years now of how you have a society where um, entrepreneurship is very encouraged and obviously successful, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, you have this massive technological development that is in great part due to the policies and the way that personal economics works in U.S. soil. I think we have to learn from that. I
Yeah.
mean,
We
we
should
don't have to
definitely.
become we
I
don't
agree.
have to become U.S. of course, but we have to learn. That is, in my opinion, that's a human experiment. It's not to do with the geography or the American identity or anything like that. I think it's a human experiment,
Mhm.
especially in a country that is made of immigrants, right? It's mostly everyone went there to do something. That something is a human experiment, and I think it has to be replicated. We have to export, we have to import some models of economic freedom and the regulation where it's relevant, and with global regulation and all this kind of like very minutia things that I'm not an expert on. But what I know is that we have to be humble in this sense, right? Like when I say I want to defend Europe and I feel European, I don't mean it in a way that, oh, I now have a flag and I'm going to like bulldoze through
Yeah.
everything. It has to be very humble and very realistic, right?
Yeah. But actually, this, I think, looking for the truth and for this humbleness is something that's very European.
Oh yeah, that's true.
That's very much a result of our heritage, and humbling. We also went through to this 2 world wars, and then seeing the communist authoritarianism in the east, and then the Franco-Phalangist we had in Spain, and the fascism. I think Europe went through a lot of history, and
Hmm.
I mean, as you said, there's also the Spanish saying before. It also sounds very much like this Voltaire quote of like, "I disapprove to what we are saying, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Right.
Yes.
So this openness for having a discourse, for talking, and maintaining the freedom to adapt. And I mean, that's also what I think makes Europe so successful. I mean, we are the safe, maybe not as prosperous as the United States, but still the safest place and with the
Mhm.
highest welfare in the world,
Yeah.
is also because we have very well developed and evolved institutions, right?
Yes.
That went through so many iterations and many changes and adaptations, and also thanks to now democracy, are capable of changing. Um, and that's something worth defending, especially against, for example, Russia, who is just slipping back into feudalism again and again, and doesn't have a very high quality of life for its
Yeah.
citizens, or very high. Actually, except of war, we are not very good at exporting anything but fossil fuels. Um,
Right. Right. Right.
yeah.
Yeah. And
So,
something I would say there, just as a maybe concluding remark, is that one of the European um, values, as you say, is the maturity of institutions. And for me, an important and essential, I would say, aspect of running a successful society is having this ecosystem of institutions, right? It's not only having a strong state and big state, because that
Yeah.
alone gives you something like China or gives you something like, very authoritarian, potentially authoritarian regimes. But if you have many different, like the academia and the journalistic estimates, right? Journalistic institutions. You have all kinds of civil society institutions that are interlocked with the political ones, with economic bodies, and all these things. I think it's such a complex system that if you take into account the complexity as a complex systems perspective,
Mhm.
I think it's which is very challenging 'cause scientifically, technically, is quite
Yeah.
difficult. But if you're aware of it, that diversity is necessary. It's like an ecosystem. An ecosystem needs diversity to dampen the different forces, right? Like when something species becomes too successful, instead of like completely destroying the ecosystem as a result, if the ecosystem is sufficiently diverse, the whole thing will sort of dampen and dissipate as time goes on. I think societies are similar, right? If you have economic powers, the judicial institutions, the journalistic institutions, civil society. There's even sporting institutions, entertainment, arts, all these things. I think they really contribute. The independence of these institutions within the rules of the game, so to speak, actually benefit the stability of and the democratic quality of the
Mhm.
country. Just as ab initio, right? Like just the amount of and diversity of them actually benefit. And this is something that I see in Europe, right? I see it's not very consolidated. You meet people that are very focused on one aspect, and other people are very focused on another aspect, and they somehow all live under the same roof, so to speak. And it's I think it's one of the values. So I would say it's a great European value that we have here. That we
Yeah.
have great societal complexity, institutionally speaking, and we are still managing to have something happen, right? We still manage to move forward.
Yeah, and we also maintain our own like European diversity. I think Europe is
Oh yeah.
extremely diverse.
Oh yeah.
Something you don't have like to this extent, for example, in China or United States is the high diversity. You can you take jump in a car, drive for 5, 6 hours, and cross across 3, 4 languages in cultural spaces, which is
Yes.
very important, as you said, because
Yes.
complex system needs some variance or some diversity. I mean, it's most obvious in something like biology. If you have very homogeneity, so for example, historically, nobility had often cousinage, and you saw with the last Spanish Habsburg king, Carl II, I think,
Yes.
he was so inbred that basically genetically he had several circles in his tree, and he was mentally completely
Yeah.
and physically very retarded, so to speak,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because just the mistakes accumulated, the genetic mistakes,
Mhm, mhm.
dysfunctional DNA accumulated from the inbreeding, and the same with like homogenic institutions,
Mhm.
or authoritarian institutions. The mistakes accumulate because you don't have any diversity that provides you with new ideas and new input or new structures, and that's why, for example, also Russia, after 26 years of Putin, is basically as a political institution has accumulated so many mistakes and dumb decisions.
Right. And
Um,
you see the battlefield tactics are definitely not very adaptive.
no, and I mean that's I think one thing, because we also said so much bad things about like the current state of discourse. I think a healthy discourse in a democracy is also um, a part that it makes it healthy is if there are a lot of different opinions and if people disagree and if they fight, this means you have actually a living democracy. Because once everyone agrees with something, you have stagnation. And
Mhm.
the balance of power and progress are both a
Mhm.
result of actually people disagreeing with each other and debating,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Um, and I mean, that's also how science progresses, right? You
Yeah.
falsify, you peer review, and dismantle things.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely. I love that you mentioned science. Science is exactly that communal effort where you're trying to integrate perspectives. If they're all integrating spontaneously, there's no progress because there's no method to develop.
Yeah.
The method runs on, you have a perspective here that is not known there. Maybe it's even incompatible with theirs, and there's all this like procedure that has to go on. One could even make the analogy that something like the European continent with all the country level diversities and linguistic diversity, cultural diversity, and within the countries, all the institutional diversities and so on. Or even if we even got to the higher level of an European level, there is the idea that you have several institutions that might operate at that pan-European level. The analogy for me is maybe as a continent or as a political system, we are doing science, right? Like it is understanding the world. It's locking into a geopolitical atmosphere or environment, right? And I think it's quite a beautiful analogy. So you need a process of network discourse and validation and falsification and so on. And that is the democratic process, right? If we ever wanted to put, if I ever wanted to give that label to something, I would give it to that, because for me, democracy is much more than representative parliamentary processes, right? It's this diverse, multi-layer, multi-scale flow of information that needs to keep on happening. And I think the consistent pattern is that the less democratic a society seems from history when we study it, or from the outside when you study, you normally see that the flows of information are narrower and narrower and narrower, or lower, right? I think it's a very good measure of the democratic quality of the society, is the flow of information. So for that, you need discourse, disagreement, you need, encounter, disencounter, and all these kinds of things. So
and I mean, that's what also makes you about Advent, like, this united in our diversity.
Yep.
Yeah, man, that was a great discussion.
Thank you. No, I enjoyed it for sure.
I think we can wrap it up a little bit now.
Absolutely.
So you're heading to Ukraine. You're still fundraising now for your for the trucks you're donating to the armed forces, to the people on the front lines.
Yes.
If
So
yeah.
No, I would just say we are now past the sort of, we're reaching the halfway point of funding for the truck. So that's the first element in the campaign. Hopefully we get to the full campaign, because that would mean that we get equipment that to detect drones earlier and actually protect the truck fully, to do all the refurbishment, the armor and so on. But really, I would be quite happy if we fund the truck fully, because that's the thing that has been decided, that we are sourcing one way or another, and it would be great that it can be known that it is through European support that this track was funded. So I do want to say that maybe both to you personally and to listeners here, that I'm super grateful to be entering this sort of Europeanist, pan-European sphere, and I'm very happy to go and talk to more people and get connected. I am new to this space, as you know, and I'm happy to. So I'm sort of sending signals out that if my profile seems attractive to you, I'm here. I want to talk. I want to chat. I want to collaborate. And very specifically, I will take the car from Alicante, my hometown, all the way to Kyiv. So that road trip, I want to make it so that maybe along the way I meet someone. So I don't know what the exact itinerary is going to be, but for example, I will pass through Vienna. Most likely, I have friends there, so I might even want to do like a couple of big stops where I actually like do a meet and greet, or if there are donors that are have contributed to the campaign, want to come. The car is going to be repainted, so we are thinking of actually like signing the actual surface of the car with messages, or with sticking something that when the people in Ukraine get it, they can see like some message of support. We probably have the list of names of people who donated there as well. This is the typical thing that people with this distraction when they donate. But is specifically, I think we'll have some markers. People can, write some personal messages or what it means to them. I'm thinking I'm open to ideas of how to cover this track in words. But maybe what Europe means to the person that is doing this, and how they think Ukraine is important as a bulwark of European values. And anyway, so I'm looking forward to this. I really hope so the link will be in the description. I massively appreciate any donation. I mean, I'm not getting that money. The Ukrainians are getting that money, so I massively appreciate that you can do it through my particular project. So yeah, it's an adventure.
And a great one. And I find it very admirable and also brave for you to go to Ukraine, put yourself out there.
Okay.
And I hope we will maybe meet in Vienna, or if you come through Germany or Austria, I will certainly show up at the meet and greet.
Great. No, I look forward to that. Absolutely.
Yeah, me too. And I will put into the description of this podcast, no matter where the people are listening to it, and on Spotify, YouTube, Substack, there will be a link to your fundraising page on forfund.com. And there will be a link to your LinkedIn. I guess that's the page where people can reach you the best, or what do you?
Anywhere, maybe the Instagram as well, LinkedIn, Instagram.
As well.
It's everything works.
Great. I will link it all. Carlos,
thank you so much, Nikodem. It's been a pleasure.
It was a great pleasure, man. Thanks for coming, and stay safe, and looking forward to meeting you.
Thank you. Me too.